Everyone laughed at the farmer when he dragged home a rusty locomotive. They called him crazy and foolish, mocked and joked behind his back. But no one expected that this heap of metal would change the life of the entire valley and silence all the mockers. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The valley had grown accustomed to its own rhythms, to the steady cycle of sowing and harvest, of rain and drought, of small scandals and endless gossip. It was the kind of place where every face was known and every action observed, where silence was never truly silent, because someone, somewhere, was always watching. Into that quiet, predictable life came a moment that no one in town would forget. The day Thomas Hale walked away from the auction yard, having purchased what most men considered nothing more than a carcass of iron. He had woken before dawn, as he always did, his body tuned to the habits of 30 years on the land. The kettle boiled slowly on the stove in his modest kitchen, hissing and rattling with the impatience of old metal. He drank his coffee without sugar, the bitterness grounding him as he sat for a few minutes in silence, staring out at the paling horizon. His farm was not large, certainly not the wide estates of the valley's wealthy ranchers, but it was his, carved into existence by sweat and perseverance. Every post of the fence, every row of wheat, every scar on his hands bore witness to his fight to hold it together when others had sold and fled. That morning, however, his thoughts did not linger on the furrows in the fields or the repairs waiting in the barn. Instead, he felt the pull of something else, something half foolish, half irresistible. For days he had heard of the auction happening on the edge of town, where the county would sell off abandoned machinery, broken trucks, heaps of rust scraped from forgotten places. Among the muttered listings he had overheard in the general store, one word had caught his ear: locomotive. An old steam engine, hauled in from some dismantled track and left to rot. To most it was a curiosity, an absurdity. To Thomas it had been like a spark in dry grass. When he arrived at the auction yard, the air smelled of oil, dust, and rust. Men in work shirts leaned against fence posts, chewing tobacco, swapping jokes as each lot was dragged into view. Shouts rose with the clang of metal, numbers flying back and forth until the auctioneer slammed his gavel and moved on. Farmers picked through scrap like scavengers, searching for a gear that might fit an old thresher or a wheel rim to weld onto a wagon. For most, it was nothing more than another day of bargains and banter. And then the locomotive appeared. It had to be hauled in on two massive flatbeds, its bulk split into pieces, but still hulking, immense, impossible to ignore. Once long ago, it must have thundered across plains and mountains, black smoke rising like banners against the sky. Now it stood silent, stripped of paint, its wheels frozen in rust, its boiler dented and split. The windows of the cab were missing, the metal sides pitted with years of decay. Grass sprouted between the cracks of its joints, as though the earth itself had begun the work of reclaiming it. The auctioneer read the listing with an almost embarrassed laugh. One steam locomotive. Condition, scrap. Opening bid. He barely finished before a wave of chuckles rolled across the crowd. No one raised a hand. Who would? What could a farmer do with such a monster? It would take an army just to move it, and a fortune to make it worth anything again. The engine seemed to stand there as a monument to futility, mocking the very idea of purpose. But Thomas felt something different stir in him. The sight of it pulled at him in ways he could not explain. He thought of the engine's weight, of the craftsmanship buried beneath corrosion, of the stories sealed in every rivet and plate. Where others saw ruin, he saw endurance. It had outlasted storms, wars, and neglect. It had outlasted men. It reminded him of himself. When the auctioneer called a second time, voice already waning, Thomas lifted his hand. The yard fell silent for a moment, then erupted in laughter. A farmer bidding on a locomotive was the funniest thing they had seen in months. The auctioneer blinked in surprise, then slammed his gavel down almost with relief. Sold, he said, to Mr. Hale. By midday, word had spread across town like wildfire. By evening, everyone in the valley had heard it. Thomas Hale had bought himself a train. In the store, men slapped their thighs and wheezed with laughter, repeating the story until tears ran down their faces. "What's he going to do with it?" one asked, and another replied, "Maybe he'll plow his fields with it if he can find a long enough chain." Even the women shook their heads, smiling with pity, murmuring that the poor man must have lost his senses. The following week brought the spectacle of the delivery. Thomas had bartered with 2 drivers to haul the massive carcass from the auction yard to his farm. The convoy rolled slowly down the dusty road, wagons groaning beneath the weight, chains creaking with each lurch. Children ran barefoot alongside, pointing and shrieking in delight. Men came out of their barns and leaned on their gates, shaking their heads in disbelief. The thing loomed like a steel beast, its shadow swallowing the road, its surfaces glowing red in the heat of the afternoon sun. It was absurd, magnificent, and utterly useless, or so they thought. When the pieces were finally set down in the field beside his barn, the earth trembled beneath the weight. The grass was crushed, the soil split, and there it stood, a rusted colossus against the sky. Thomas stood nearby, hands resting on his hips, face streaked with sweat. But his eyes shone with something rare, something that unsettled those who watched. For while they laughed, he seemed to see not what was, but what could be. His brother came that weekend to see it for himself. George took one look, threw back his head, and roared with laughter. "You've outdone yourself this time, Tom," he said, kicking at one of the iron wheels until flakes of rust scattered like brittle leaves. "What's next? Maybe you'll buy yourself a battleship to go with it?" The nephews clambered up the side of the boiler, shouting, pretending to drive, their small hands blackened with soot and decay. Thomas said little. He only watched them, his jaw set, his silence mistaken for shame. But when evening came and the farm quieted, he walked out alone to stand before the engine. The field stretched around him, golden in the fading light. The barn behind him leaned with the years the animals drowsed in their pens. The locomotive towered, a silhouette against the sinking sun, its surface rough with age. Thomas reached out and touched the metal. It was warm beneath his palm, solid, unyielding. In that moment, the ridicule of the valley seemed to fade. The world saw only ruin. He saw a challenge. He saw a reflection of himself, weathered, mocked, underestimated, but not yet defeated. The locomotive, like him, still had breath somewhere deep inside. All it needed was patience, strength, and someone too stubborn to give up. That night, as coyotes howled in the hills and the stars wheeled silently overhead, Thomas made a decision. He would not surrender to their laughter. He would not see the locomotive as scrap, no matter how loudly the world declared it so. It was his now, bound to him as firmly as the land he worked. What it once was had ended, but what it could become was just beginning. And with that thought, he turned toward the house, the sound of the wind rustling through the dry grass behind him, and knew that tomorrow when the sun rose, he would begin. The first days after the locomotive arrived at his farm were the loudest in memory, not because of the machine itself, but because of the voices it stirred all across the valley. No one could pass down the road without slowing their wagon or horse to gape at the hulking mass of rust that sat in Thomas Hale's yard. It rose above the fence line like a ruin dragged out of another age, its bulk grotesque and mesmerizing at once. Word spread quickly that Thomas had truly gone mad, that he had not only bought the thing, but seemed intent on keeping it. For the farmers of the valley, there was no greater folly than wasting strength on something that could not plow, sow, or reap. The laughter began at the auction, but now deepened into something more cutting, for ridicule ripens when watered daily by gossip. Each morning Thomas carried on with his work in the fields, as he always had, his boots biting into the soil, his back bending with the weight of labor. Yet he could feel the eyes on him, even when he pretended not to notice. Passing wagons slowed, children stood on seats to point and giggle. Men leaned against fence posts, just long enough for their chuckles to drift across the wind. The words were not always loud, but he caught them nonetheless. "Hale's folly," they whispered. "The iron coffin. A farmer who dreams of railroads instead of harvests." At the market in town, the jokes were sharper still. When he stepped into the store for salt and flour, the room quieted only long enough to ensure he heard the laughter that followed. A man slapped his thigh and called out, "Tom, when do we buy tickets for your Grand Line? Will you carry us to the moon on that rust heap?" Another added, "Best mind the children don't burn themselves when they climb your new jungle gym." Ahi, the laughter rippled through the crowd, not cruel enough to be hatred, but cruel enough to sting. Thomas managed a faint smile, paid for his goods, and left in silence, though every step back to his wagon carried the weight of their jeers. Even those closest to him did not spare their judgment. His brother George came by again, this time not with laughter alone but with a scolding edge. He shook his head at the sight of the engine, its wheels half buried in the dirt, its surfaces still flaking red dust into the wind. "What are you keeping this for, Tom? You'll break your back trying to move it, and for what? You can't sell wheat with it, can't water cattle with it. Best haul it to the scrapyard before it topples over and crushes someone." His words were not meant as cruelty, but as the exasperation of family who cannot understand. Yet they cut deep, for Thomas was used to enduring hardship, but not to being dismissed as a fool by his own blood. Children treated it as their playground. Barefoot boys scrambled up the ladder to the cab, their laughter echoing across the field as they tugged at levers that no longer moved. They shouted like conductors, shrieking whistles and train calls, their heels banging against the iron until flakes rained down like reddish snow. When Thomas asked them gently to climb down, they ran off down the road, still laughing, calling over their shoulders that perhaps he thought treasure lay inside its belly. Their voices carried long after they vanished, leaving only the sound of wind moving through the dry grass. At Sunday service, even the preacher found words that seemed aimed at him, though no name was spoken. He warned of the dangers of pride, of letting stubbornness lead a man astray from the true work of his life. "We must not cling to things that waste our strength," the preacher said. And though the congregation nodded solemnly, Thomas felt their eyes slide toward him. He lowered his head, not in shame, but to keep the fire in his chest from flaring into anger. Day by day the pressure mounted. Friends who had once respected his endurance now muttered that perhaps age had bent his mind. His sister, gentle in her concern, leaned across the supper table and told him softly that rust would never feed him and dreams would never pay debts. He thanked her kindly as he always did, but said nothing more. There was no language that could explain to them what he felt. For Thomas it was not treasure he sought, not wealth or glory, but something else that he himself could not yet name. It was a sense of purpose, the feeling that the locomotive had not arrived on his land by chance but by some strange necessity, as if both man and machine had been left behind by the world and now found each other in mutual exile. The more they mocked, the deeper his resolve became. In the evenings, after the fields had been tended and the livestock fed, he walked to where the locomotive sat. The setting sun bathed its surfaces in red, turning rust into fire, as if the beast still held embers in its belly. He touched its cold sides and felt, not defeat, but stubborn possibility. Each insult he had endured seemed to fuse him more tightly to the iron. Where they saw only a coffin of steel, he saw a puzzle waiting to be solved, a monument that whispered of hidden worth. There were nights when the loneliness of his conviction pressed heavily upon him. Standing in the yard with the dogs howling at the hills, his hands blackened from scraping corrosion, his back aching, he asked the empty fields why he persisted. No answer came, only the sigh of wind through the dry grass. Yet he felt the answer was already inside him. He could no more abandon the locomotive than he could abandon his own land. Both were stubborn, both scarred, both doubted by others, and both still alive beneath the weight of time. The valley continued to laugh. It was their entertainment, the tale they told at suppers and in stores. Yet the laughter no longer reached him in the same way. He carried it like a cloak, heavy, uncomfortable, but no longer unbearable. In its shadow, his determination grew stronger, sharper, more focused. He began to think of the locomotive not as junk but as a mirror, reflecting back his own endurance. Where others saw folly, he saw the faint outline of redemption. And so the days turned into weeks, the jeers of neighbors becoming as constant as the wind, and still Thomas refused to yield. Each dawn he rose to work his land. Each dusk he stood before the iron carcass that had become his burden and his hope. He did not know then what path he had chosen, only that he would walk it to the end. For in the silence between heartbeats, in the glow of sunset on rust, He felt a strange certainty. The locomotive was not yet finished, and neither was he. The days that followed settled into a peculiar rhythm. By daylight, Thomas carried on with the work that kept his farm alive, tending to his rows of wheat, repairing fence posts, feeding livestock, hauling water, and mending tools that had already lived longer than most men would have expected. His body was disciplined by decades of repetition, the same motions carried out with quiet endurance. But every evening, as the sun bent low over the western hills and the air began to cool, his thoughts shifted from fields and chores to the hulking carcass of iron that waited beside the barn. The locomotive stood there like an uninvited guest, enormous and silent, but in his eyes it was something else, something more alive than the people around him could ever imagine. The jeers of his neighbors did not cease. In fact, the more they saw him walk toward the machine at dusk with tools in hand, the louder their laughter grew. They called out from wagons that rattled past on the road, asking when the great train would blow its whistle, when he would carry passengers across his pasture, when his iron beast would plow furrows instead of his old mule. Children still scrambled onto its boiler, shrieking in play, while men leaned against their fences and muttered that Thomas Hale had lost the last of his sense. But he heard them as one hears the buzz of flies in the summer heat, annoying, persistent, and ultimately powerless. Their mockery was constant, but so was his resolve, and it was his resolve that won each evening as he approached the machine and laid his hands on its corroded surface. At first his work seemed futile. The locomotive was more rust than steel, a mountain of decay that crumbled under every stroke of his brush. With a stiff wire brush he scraped at its hide, the bristles tearing away flakes of reddish dust until his hands blistered and bled. The air filled with the acrid smell of iron, his clothes stained until they seemed made of rust themselves. He worked for hours, sometimes by lantern light, stripping away years of neglect to reveal the stubborn solidity beneath. Each line of clean steel that emerged was like a whispered reply from the machine, a reminder that beneath its ruin, the heart of its strength remained. Once the surface began to yield, he turned to its insides. He climbed into the cab where the glass was long gone and the levers locked in place by corrosion. He pried at bolts that snapped in his hands, wrestled with gears that refused to move, and cursed softly when smoke from his lantern stung his eyes. Yet in these struggles he felt alive, as though each battle with iron were a dialogue, a contest of wills between man and machine. It was not about winning quickly, but about enduring, about proving to himself and to the locomotive that neither would give in. He fashioned replacements for pieces too far gone to save. In his shed he heated scrap metal in a crude forge, hammering it on an anvil until sparks flew into the night. Old plow blades became brackets, broken wagon rims became rings, and rusted tools gave birth to bolts and pins. The work was slow and clumsy, but his hands, hardened by years of farming, found surprising steadiness in shaping unfamiliar parts. There was no manual, no guidance but instinct, yet he trusted those instincts. The same stubbornness that had carried him through droughts and lean harvests now guided him through the mystery of steam and steel. More than once he nearly lost heart. There were nights when he collapsed onto the steps of his barn, his arms trembling, his back a knot of pain. He would look at the immovable bulk of the locomotive and ask himself why he persisted. The voices of his neighbors seemed to echo in his skull, laughter chasing him even in solitude. Yet always, when his breath steadied and the sting of sweat left his eyes, he felt again that quiet certainty. This machine was not scrap. It was a challenge, a promise, and perhaps even a calling. As weeks passed, the landscape of the locomotive began to change. Where once the boiler was pitted and flaking, now patches of steel gleamed faintly in the light. The wheels, though still frozen, showed the faint outline of curves beneath their corrosion. The cab, once filled only with dust and cobwebs, now bore the marks of his hands, cleaned levers, oiled joints, and fresh bolts hammered into place. It was still broken, still a ruin, but it was no longer silent. When he tapped at the boiler with his hammer, the echo rang clearer, as though the beast were stirring in its sleep. His neighbors noticed, of course. Passing wagons slowed longer, men muttered more pointedly, women shook their heads with pity that shaded into concern. Some suggested openly that he was throwing away the little strength he had left. His sister warned him over supper that stubbornness would not fill a man's stomach. But Thomas only listened in silence, as was his habit, and returned to his work. He had learned long ago that no argument could silence doubt, only proof. He began to study as well as labor. In the evenings when his body demanded rest, he pored over old books he found in town, manuals from the days when steam was king, borrowed from dusty shelves or traded for sacks of grain. The words were dry, the diagrams strange, but he absorbed what he could, piecing together an understanding that grew not from knowledge alone, but from touch, from sweat, from the rhythm of labor. He became student and teacher both, guided by the faint logic of design that seemed to whisper from the iron itself. There were accidents, too. Once a valve burst under his hand, sending a spray of filthy water across his face, blinding him for a moment with the sting of rust and grit. Another time a piece of iron slipped from his grasp, cutting a deep gash in his leg that bled freely until he wrapped it tight with a strip of cloth. He bore these wounds without complaint, as he bore every scar earned in the fields, seeing them as part of the price a man pays when he chooses not to yield. The seasons pressed on, summer deepened, the sun blazing down on his farm until the soil cracked and dust hung in the air like smoke. Yet every evening, as the cicadas sang and the horizon glowed red, he returned to the locomotive. Sometimes he worked until the stars wheeled high above, his lantern casting long shadows across the iron plates, the night filled with the ringing of hammer on steel. Neighbors heard the sound and muttered that madness had taken him. But he knew that what they called madness was only persistence, and persistence had been the root of every victory he had ever known. By the end of that season, something undeniable had shifted. The locomotive, though still broken, no longer resembled a carcass abandoned in a field. It bore the marks of care, of struggle, of patient hands refusing to let it rot. It was still mocked, still dismissed, but beneath its scars it had begun to live again. One evening, as he struck at a bolt near the front of the boiler, a sound rose that startled even him. It was not the dull thud of rusted iron, but a hollow resonance, clear and deep, as though the machine itself had spoken back. Thomas paused, breath caught in his chest, and listened. The night was still, the fields quiet, the dogs silent in their pens. He tapped again, and again the sound came, like a heart beating faintly in the dark. He lowered his hammer, stood with sweat dripping from his brow, and felt a strange calm settle over him. It was not victory, not yet, but it was proof that his labor had not been in vain. The beast was not dead. Somewhere deep within its iron shell, it still carried life, waiting for the moment a man stubborn enough would bring it forth. And so he turned toward the house when the lantern burned low, his hands aching, his clothes stiff with rust and grease, but his spirit lighter than it had been in years. Behind him the locomotive loomed, its surface gleaming faintly in the starlight. No longer a monument to ruin, but a vessel of possibility. The valley still laughed, of course. They would continue to laugh for many months more. But Thomas Hale no longer heard them in the same way, for he had heard another sound, a truer sound, echoing from the heart of iron. And that sound told him that his work had only just begun. By the time autumn began to lean across the valley, the locomotive had already consumed months of Thomas Hale's nights and much of his strength. He rose before dawn, tended to his fields and animals, and returned at dusk to chip, scrape, hammer, and polish until lantern light flickered across the iron beast's surface. The laughter of his neighbors remained as constant as the chirring of crickets, and yet something inside him had grown immune to it. The mockery that once stung now slid over him like rain over stone. For every cruel word, for every shake of the head, he had a line of clean steel to show for it. A lever that moved where once it had been frozen, a gear that turned with a faint protest instead of silence. These were not treasures the valley could measure, but to him they were worth more than gold. The first true sign that the locomotive still carried breath within its carcass came on a night when the air was sharp with the scent of frost. Thomas had fed the firebox for days with kindling and scraps, testing its appetite for flame, coaxing the ashes from their stubborn sleep. That evening, with a lantern propped on a nearby crate, he crouched beside the machine and fed it wood until the small fire grew, licking the blackened walls. Smoke rose in lazy threads, curling upward into the night. At first it was no different from the many other attempts that had ended in sputters and disappointment, but then came a sound that froze him in place. It was faint, almost timid, but there it was. A hiss, long and steady, like the exhalation of lungs waking after a long silence. Steam, thin and pale, seeped from a crack along the side of the boiler. It rose into the cold air in a fragile column that drifted toward the stars. Thomas dropped his tools and stepped back, heart hammering. For weeks he had wondered if the heart of the beast would ever stir again, and now here it was, whispering to him in the language of pressure and breath. He touched the side of the boiler, hot now beneath his palm, and closed his eyes. The following morning, the neighbors saw the thin streak of soot on his roof and laughed louder than before. They told one another that Hale was burning junk in his field for warmth, that he was filling his land with smoke for no reason but madness. Some said he was trying to summon ghosts with his fires, others that he was chasing illusions too heavy to carry. They could not hear what Thomas had heard, that hiss like a sigh, that faint heartbeat of a giant too stubborn to die. He said nothing to defend himself. He let their laughter roll on the wind while he gathered fresh wood and coal and returned to his work. As the weeks pressed forward, he fed the firebox more often, learning how the metal responded. Each attempt brought more heat, more noise, more resistance from joints and pipes that had forgotten their purpose. The machine coughed, spat, and groaned, its voice raw from disuse, but still it answered. The sound of shuddering echoes filled the farm at night, mingling with the cries of owls and the distant howls of coyotes. For Thomas, it was a music finer than any hymn, the music of steel awakening. He replaced broken pipes with lengths he forged himself, scavenged from plows and wagons long past their prime. He cleaned soot from chambers, scrubbed valves until his hands bled, and oiled gears that squealed like frightened animals before settling into smoother turns. His tools were simple, but his patience was vast, and with each hour the locomotive gave up another fraction of its silence. One evening, after stoking the fire until his shirt clung to him with sweat, he heard it again, the rhythm of something alive. A deep knock, uneven but insistent, echoed from within the belly of the beast. It was as though the machine were testing its own memory, recalling the cadence of wheels that had once thundered across the earth. Thomas stood in the cab, lantern light painting his face in gold, and listened with a reverence usually reserved for prayer. He had lived his whole life by stubbornness, yet in that moment he felt he was in the presence of a miracle, not of heaven, but of human endurance forged in iron. The valley still shook its head. Wagons slowed on the road, their drivers smirking as they watched him shovel coal into the gaping mouth of his machine. Women whispered that he had lost his sense, that the loneliness of the farm had driven him to folly. Children shouted from the fence, mocking whistles and bellows, pretending to faint at the sight of smoke drifting into the sky. Their laughter had teeth, but Thomas no longer flinched. He only lifted more coal, shoveled more ash, and leaned into the rhythm of his work. The nights became longer, darker, colder. Frost rimed the fields, and the stars wheeled bright and merciless above. Yet Thomas pressed on. He knew the machine was not yet ready to move, not yet ready to prove itself to the valley, but he could feel the tide turning. Where once the locomotive had been nothing more than dead weight, now it was a creature slowly remembering its own strength. He often stood before it at dusk, watching the glow of the firebox seep faintly through the cracks, the metal skin breathing steam into the night. To others it was still a carcass, still a folly, but to him it had become a companion, a partner in stubbornness. Each hiss and groan seemed to echo his own heartbeat, each plume of smoke a reminder that endurance was not in vain. When the first true plume of steam burst from the stack with a sound like a roar, Thomas nearly wept. It was not graceful, not strong, but it was undeniable. The valley dogs barked at the noise, children stopped in their play, and neighbors turned their heads toward the sound. Some muttered that he was burning his farm down. Others laughed that he had taught his scrap heap to sigh. But Thomas knew better. He had felt the pulse of power in the floor beneath his feet, the tremor of something vast shaking itself awake. That night, long after the fires dimmed and the fields lay quiet, Thomas remained in the cab, his lantern burning low. He rested his hands on the levers, cleaned and oiled but still stiff, and felt the warmth of the steel beneath his palms. The machine was not yet ready to move, but it was alive. Alive in a way no laughter could deny, alive in a way that no scorn could bury. And in that knowledge he found strength enough to endure another season, another wave of ridicule, another year if necessary. For the locomotive was not only a machine of iron and fire, it was a promise that stubbornness had meaning, that ridicule could be endured, that even the most lifeless shell might breathe again if given patience enough. And as the stars wheeled high above the valley and the fields stretched silent beneath the frost, Thomas Hale knew with absolute certainty that the work of his hands was only beginning to bear fruit. The beast had stirred, its first breath had been drawn, and one day soon it would rise. Winter passed heavily across the valley, its snows thin and its winds sharp, and with the turn of spring, the farmers who had once laughed at Thomas Hale found themselves staring at skies that held no rain. The clouds drifted by, empty and pale, and the earth below began to crack beneath the merciless sun. Rivers that once curled through meadows shrank to sluggish streams, wells dropped lower with each bucket drawn, and by midsummer the valley was choking on dust. The grass on the hills withered into straw. Animals staggered from thirst, and families began whispering words they had never dared utter aloud before: abandonment, departure, surrender. Through it all, Thomas kept to his rhythm. He sowed and watered as best he could, coaxing life from soil that resisted him at every turn, and in the evenings he returned to the locomotive, feeding its hunger for coal and wood, tightening bolts, replacing seals, and coaxing it to breathe more freely with each attempt. By now the neighbors no longer laughed as loudly. Some still chuckled when they saw smoke rise from his yard at dusk, but their voices carried less conviction. Desperation has a way of stripping scorn from a man's throat. Their own cattle balked at the foul water that remained, their children grew sick from wells gone sour, and the weight of fear pressed against every household. By late summer, the situation had become dire. Wagons carried barrels farther and farther in search of water, returning half empty, the liquid brackish and foul. Men argued in the square over rights to stagnant ponds. Mothers hushed their children with dry lips, and even the wealthiest ranchers felt the bite of a sky that offered no mercy. It was in this climate of despair that Thomas began to sense the hour he had been waiting for was approaching, though he spoke of it to no one. He had no need to. He had lived through enough seasons to know that when the land pressed hardest against a man, it was the time to prove what he was made of. The decision came not from triumph, but from necessity. One evening when the sun bled red across the horizon, and the wind carried with it the sour stench of the dying river, Thomas walked out to the locomotive with his tools and his coal, and felt a stillness settle over him. He had been preparing for this moment for months, perhaps longer than that. Now the time had come to see whether his stubbornness had meaning, or if the world had been right to mock him all along. He worked until the stars climbed high, feeding the firebox with wood until the flames roared like a beast awakened. Steam hissed from every seam, filling the yard with a ghostly mist. The pipes rattled, the gears groaned, and the wheels shuddered as if struggling to remember what motion was. Sweat poured down his back, his hands blackened with soot, his ears filled with the deepening growl of pressure. Then came the moment he had dreamed of through all those long nights, the sound of a whistle, faint and cracked, but unmistakable. The locomotive cried out into the dark, and the cry rolled across the valley like thunder. Dogs barked, children woke, neighbors stirred from their beds and stared toward Hale's farm with wide eyes. The following morning the first of them came, not with laughter, but with desperation. They found Thomas already at work, shoveling coal, checking valves, adjusting the levers he had coaxed back into life. Smoke curled thick into the air, and the engine's boiler glowed with a heat that shimmered in the rising sun. One man called out, half mocking, half pleading, asking if Hale's beast could carry water as well as it carried smoke. Thomas said little. He only pointed to the barrels he had already loaded into a makeshift flat car he had welded together from spare iron and wood. With a grunt, he threw the last shovel of coal into the firebox, and the locomotive answered with a deep shudder. The ground trembled beneath its wheels as they shifted, first with resistance, then with grudging movement. Metal screamed against rust, sparks flew, and then, with a lurch that nearly tore the breath from his lungs, the great machine moved. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, it rolled forward, dragging the flat car behind it, the barrels sloshing with precious water drawn from a hidden spring Thomas had found deep beneath his land. Neighbors who had gathered at the fence fell silent, their faces pale, their eyes wide. The laughter they had carried for months caught in their throats, replaced by awe and disbelief. Thomas guided the locomotive down the old forgotten stretch of track that still cut across the edge of his property, rails warped, but passable after his months of secret labor. Each groan of the wheels, each hiss of steam, was a defiance hurled into the silence of the valley. He drove the machine into the heart of the drought-stricken land, delivering water where wagons had failed, filling troughs for cattle, barrels for families, and jars for children who had gone too long without clean drink. The valley watched in silence as the monster of rust they had mocked became their salvation. Women wept openly as their children cupped handfuls of cool water to their lips. Men who had called him a fool stood with hats in hand, their pride shriveled beneath the undeniable truth before their eyes. Even the wealthiest ranchers who had once dismissed him with scorn came riding to see the miracle, their mouths tight with envy, their eyes sharp with calculations. The machine roared on, coughing smoke into the sky, every turn of its wheels a testament to the endurance of one man who had refused to yield. The jeers that had haunted Thomas for so long were gone now, swallowed by the hiss of steam and the thunder of iron. The valley no longer laughed. It stood hushed, its people staring as though they had seen a corpse rise from the earth. When the day ended and the machine finally rested, its boiler sighing with the release of pressure, Thomas stood in the fading light and looked upon the faces gathered around. There was no triumph in his expression, no gloating. He was not a man who needed words to prove himself. The proof lay in the water trickling from barrels into troughs, in the life returning to the eyes of children, in the silence that had replaced laughter. The hour of trial had come, and the verdict was written not in the voices of men, but in the hiss of steam and the quenching of thirst. The locomotive, once called a coffin of iron, had become a vessel of survival, and Thomas Hale, mocked, scorned, and humiliated, stood quietly beside it, knowing that the work of his stubborn hands had spoken louder than any sermon, louder than any jeer, louder even than the whistle that still echoed faintly across the dry hills. When the dust of that first trial had settled, when the locomotive had proved itself not as a monument of rust, but as a vessel of life, the valley was never the same again. What had once been a story of ridicule and mockery now transformed into whispers that carried awe, fear, and unease in equal measure. The laughter that had echoed around Thomas Hale's name for so many months was silenced, and in its place lay a new, heavy quiet, the kind that comes when people know they have seen something they cannot unsee. Where once he had been the subject of cruel jests, now he was watched with eyes filled with questions, suspicion, and even reverence. The very next morning, families began arriving at his farm, their wagons creaking under the weight of barrels, jars, and pails. They came not in mockery, but in desperate hope, their faces drawn with thirst, their voices hushed as though they were approaching a shrine. One by one, they stood in his yard as Thomas loaded their vessels into the flat car, the locomotive standing behind him like some slumbering beast, smoke curling faintly from its stack. He did not boast, he did not scold, and he did not remind them of the laughter they had thrown at him. Instead, he worked silently, drawing water from the hidden spring, pouring it into their containers, and sending them back with life where death had begun to take hold. At first they were cautious, ashamed to meet his eyes, but when they saw that he gave freely, refusing payment, their shame softened into something more complex. Mothers wept as their children drank, old men clutched cups in trembling hands, and voices broke with gratitude they could not put into words. By evening, the line of wagons stretched far down the road, and the farmyard that had once been the place of ridicule had become the heart of the valley. But gratitude is never the only thing that grows in such soil. With every vessel of water Thomas gave, unease deepened among the wealthier men of the valley. Virgil Moore, whose deep wells and broad lands had once made him master of others' survival, felt the ground shift beneath his boots. He came riding one afternoon, his face carved in stone, and stood beside the locomotive as though measuring it against his own pride. He asked questions with clipped words, demanded to know how Thomas had done it, whether the spring was endless, whether the machine could be controlled by anyone but him. Thomas answered calmly, showing him the gears, the valves, the rhythm of the fire and the pressure, but he did so without flinching, without offering more than what was plain. Moore left without drinking the water, but his silence was heavier than any laughter had ever been. Still, the people came. Every morning the wagons lined up. Every evening they returned to their homes with barrels brimming, and little by little, life returned to the valley. The sickness that had plagued the children began to ease. The cattle once again drank without balking, and the fear that had clung to the air like smoke began to lift. The machine, once called a coffin of iron, had become the fountain of survival, and Thomas Hale, once mocked as a fool, was now seen as something else entirely. Yet for all the change, Thomas himself remained the same. He rose before dawn, tended to his land, and in the evenings fed the firebox, cleaned the pipes, and listened to the hiss of steam with the quiet devotion of a man in prayer. He did not walk with his head high in pride, nor did he remind others of their cruelty. He knew too well that triumph was fleeting, that gratitude could sour as quickly as laughter. He had no illusions that the road ahead would be free of struggle. Already he saw the calculating eyes of men like Moore. Already he heard whispers that perhaps the machine should belong to the town, to the wealthiest ranchers, or to someone with the authority to manage it. He knew that envy and fear would soon rise to challenge him, just as laughter once had. But as he stood in the evening glow, watching the last families depart with their filled vessels, Thomas felt a peace unlike any he had known before. The locomotive stood beside him, no longer silent, no longer a ruin, but alive and purposeful. He thought back to the day he had first struck his spade against its buried iron flank, to the jeers that had followed him from that moment, and he allowed himself the faintest of smiles. They had called him a fool, but the fool had saved them all. In time, others would try to copy what he had done. Some would fail, their hands lacking the patience. Others would succeed in part, but none could erase the truth of what had already been revealed. The locomotive was more than a machine now. It was a symbol, a reminder that endurance has its reward, that ridicule can be endured, and that even in the most rusted shell, there may lie a key to survival. It was the proof that faith and patience, even in the face of universal scorn, could turn the worthless into the priceless. That night, as stars wheeled silently across the valley sky, Thomas fed the firebox one last time and listened to the machine breathe in rhythm with his own heart. He poured water from the spring into its tank, watched it trickle through the pipes and out into a trough where his animals drank eagerly, and felt a quiet satisfaction that no laughter or envy could steal from him. The revelation was not just in the water it produced or the lives it had saved, but in the truth it had carved into the valley itself. That hope can be hidden in rust, that strength can be buried in ridicule, and that one man's stubborn belief can shift the course of many lives. And so the valley endured, not by the wealth of its ranchers, nor by the strength of its traditions, but by the quiet labor of one farmer who refused to let go of what others had abandoned. In the heart of drought, in the shadow of despair, Thomas Hale and his resurrected locomotive had given them life. The world beyond might never know the story, but in the valley his name would no longer be a punchline. It would be a lesson, carried on the steam that once drifted into the night, whispered in the silence that followed laughter, and remembered in every clear drop of water drawn from the machine they had once mocked as nothing more than a coffin of iron. If you were amazed by this story, don't stop here. Hit subscribe right now so you never miss the next unbelievable twist. Tap the bell so you're always the first to see what happens next. Check out the other shocking stories waiting for you on this channel, each one more mind-blowing than the last. And don't keep this to yourself. Share this video with your friends and family so they can be stunned right along with you.